Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us this evening for Bord Bia's first beef farmer webinar. We're in unprecedented times, so this is an opportunity for us to update you on market developments and the outlook from a Bord Bia perspective. And normally we maybe might have met at farm meetings and other such opportunities and conferences and so on, but this just represents an opportunity to get the information out to you as producers that we think may be useful and interesting, and we hope that you'll find it interesting and that you'll take the opportunity maybe to ask questions. Just by way of background, my name is Joe Burke. I'm the Senior Manager for the Meat and Livestock team in Bord Bia, and I'm going to give a short presentation in a minute, but we'll be also joined by my colleague Mark Zieg, who's our Beef Sector Manager, and likewise Mark is going to give us a short presentation on the market situation currently and Bord Bia's promotional opportunities and activities. And finally then we'll have a presentation from Mick Houlihan, who's our Sustainable Quality Assurance Manager, and Mick is going to tell us about the Bord Bia grass-fed standard. So that's an overview of the presentations. A reminder that you can send questions to our panelists, which we will take then after the presentations. So you have two options with regard to the questions. You can either use the questions function within this platform. So there's a drop-down arrow there for questions within the box on your screen. You may need to exit out of the full screen mode in order to enter your questions. Or alternatively, you can text my colleague in Bord Bia on 087 645 0170, and you can input your question there for any of our panelists, and we'd be happy to address them after the presentations. So without further ado, I want to address the first topic of this evening, which is the market outlook for beef and livestock. And I have a number of areas to focus on, but firstly, just to recap on Irish beef exports from a market perspective, that the overall value of Irish beef exports, including offal and including primary meat exports, and including value-added beef exports, has an overall value of 2.3 billion. And in 2020, within that, we had a value of 1.9 billion for primary beef, so that makes up the vast majority of our fresh and frozen beef exports. Offal had a value of just over 190 million, and similarly there was about 200 million of what we call value-added beef products exported that have undergone some additional processing and value add. But to focus on the primary beef exports that we export to a number of key markets, both internationally as well as around Europe. The UK was our most important market. It accounted for 46% overall of the volume of Irish primary beef exported, and that actually increased slightly on 2019 levels. And continental Europe then was the next most important destination, accounting for 44% of Irish beef exports in 2020. And international markets, even though relatively small at 10%, actually those have increased substantially year on year over the last few years, and they collectively accounted for, as I say, 10% of Irish beef exports in 2020. So that's just by way of background in relation to the key export destinations. And if we look at the year to date in terms of cattle supplies, we can see that overall cattle supplies are down by almost 10% at just over 478,000 head. But in recent weeks, it's just in the last 2 weeks that we've seen cattle weekly throughput exceed the equivalent levels of last year. And we'll all remember that this time last year, we were just at the beginning of the pandemic, and that impacted on processing levels. So actually there were fewer numbers of animals processed at that time because demand was so impacted. So actually we've seen throughput levels slightly higher over the last couple of weeks, but overall for the year to date, a significant tightening in availability And we'd see that continuing over the coming months, whereby we would expect overall throughput to remain or even to decline slightly, even below the 30,000 head per week. And looking at it in slightly more detail, particularly in relation to the prime cattle availability, that if we look at the Department of Agriculture's Animal Identification and Movement Database, or AIM database, on the 1st of March, we know that looking at the number of male cattle in the system, there was a decline in the numbers of animals approaching slaughter age. In other words, the animals aged 2 years of age or over, or up to 36 months, if you like, on the 1st of March, were down by 44,000 head. So that's quite significant, and we're seeing that impact following through in lower prime cattle availability, particularly steers. And if we look at the female side of the equation, we can see that there's a similar trend, and these are specifically the numbers of beef females. So they're the heifers that are of a beef breed or a beef cross. And similarly, the animals that were aged over 24 months on the 1st of March are down 30,000 collectively. So the combination of those two factors would indicate that steers and heifers are likely to be considerably tighter over the coming months and even through to the end of the year. And when we see the higher numbers coming through in the younger age categories, those are mainly animals that were born either in early spring of last year or indeed already this year in 2021. So we're seeing higher numbers there, both as a result of lower live exports, but higher calf registrations as well too over the past 2 years. So those are unlikely to impact on cattle supplies in 2021, but we are likely to see the supplies creeping up as we get into next year and the following year. Looking at this, and we had previously forecasts of up to 80,000 fewer cattle available, but we revised those recently in view of a few different developments. But we expect there will be up to 120,000 fewer cattle available in 2021 than last year, as a result of a few factors. That 2019 in particular was a very strong year for calf exports, so many of them were exported out of the country at that time, combined with the fact that we've seen a reduction in young bull finishing, and as a result of that, those male animals which previously would have been slaughtered as young bulls are now being slaughtered up to 9 months older, which is likely to push many of them into next year. And finally then, we've seen very strong live exports to Northern Ireland, which in turn has taken quite a lot of animals out of the system. And we can see here live exports for the year to date broken down by market. And while there were reductions in live exports at the beginning of this year, mainly driven by fewer calves being exported, overall that has balanced out for the year to date. So we actually have seen for the year to date an equivalent number of cattle being exported as during the same period last year. Within this, you can see that certain markets are up. For example, in Northern Ireland, a very strong increase there, both in finished cattle as well as store animals going up there for further finishing. So that has been really the standout performer across the different live export markets. Overall, calf exports have declined, although not as seriously as maybe might have previously been worried. It's down collectively by 6% in terms of calves, but as I said, that has been more than compensated for by higher exports of stores and finished cattle. So you can see there the picture. Certain markets have also performed strongly, and that would include the likes of Spain and Italy, where we've also seen higher numbers of animals being exported. The Netherlands would be a key call out in that demand for calves there has been lower as a result of a downturn really in the veal industry and slower demand as a result of the pandemic. But to focus a little bit more on our beef market for the moment, in relation to our key export market, the UK, there is a forecast there that similar to ourselves, they're going to have fewer cattle available for slaughter. In fact, their beef production looks set to fall by 5%. And the AHDB forecasts indicate that imports of beef into the UK will rise by about 4%. And that is positive because overall Ireland accounts for approximately 80% of total beef imports into the UK. And this forecast would take into account that food service, as it recovers, will result in a strong uplift in demand and in consumption levels. And similarly, when we look across other key European markets, there are forecasts of tighter cattle supplies and reduced beef production. So this is positive for us as a key beef exporter, that overall we're going to see, or likely to see, a reduction of 2% in the available beef supply across Europe. That market will also be somewhat tighter. Consumption is forecast to decline slightly, and this is also reflecting somewhat more difficult economic environment, that consumer spending power, is likely to be impacted by the pandemic. But on the other hand, it's not that significant in that it's a reduction of less than 1%, which is less than what we had seen in recent years. And across different member states, there are different forecasts in terms of likely beef production and availability. But I suppose most positively there you can see the likes of Germany and France forecasting declines in the region of 4%. So Germany in particular represents a key opportunity and a market that has grown significantly for Irish beef in recent years. So moving on to the most recent, I suppose, beef cattle price comparisons, and this graph focuses on R3 male cattle. And the Irish R3 steer price, we know, had a difficult beginning of the year. January and February cattle prices were low, even in comparison to the same period in 2020. But we have seen a very strong recovery in recent weeks. And even, in fact, we just got last week's cattle prices in just a while ago. And in fact, there was a further increase of 7 cents a kilo last week in the average Irish R3 steer price, bringing it up to an average of 4.04 a kilo. If we look at the UK, between Britain and Northern Ireland, on average, an R3 steer, this would be for the week before last, but it was averaged out at €4.66. So the UK market performing very, very strongly, and in particular a strong demand there for domestic beef, for British beef, driving higher cattle prices. And on average, across continental Europe, where most of the cattle are finished as young bulls, on average, the EU average price for an R3 young bull is sitting at €3.80 a kilo. So that has also strengthened slightly, but it does show that the market environment is quite competitive when you look across continental Europe relative to the situation in the UK. And we have a measure called the composite price, and the Irish composite price is collectively the average price that is paid for all of the different categories of cattle when it's averaged out on a weekly basis. So the prime Irish composite takes into account the prices of steers, heifers and young bulls across all of the different grades. So it's the average of all of those prices paid. And then we have a comparator, and this is I suppose something that we watch and update continuously on the Bord Bia market tracker on the beef section of the Bord Bia website, which I'd encourage you to have a look at. And the export benchmark takes into account the average prevailing cattle prices across all of those markets that we export beef to. So it would be a kind of a theoretical price that if we got the averages of the prevailing cattle prices across all of those markets, on average, what would that equate to? So in fact, over the year to date, on average, cattle prices here were lower than across Europe and the UK, where we mainly export our beef, as I said. But actually, the Irish cattle price, comprising of that composite, last week passed out that export benchmark. In other words, it's strengthened, and collectively it actually strengthened by 7 cents a kilo. So it passed out, as I said, that export benchmark value. And for the year to date, it sits at 4 cents a kilo on average behind that comparator. So, it's a slight differential there on average. I want to draw your attention to what is happening across a few different key markets. And I touched there on the situation in Ireland and in the UK. Elsewhere across Europe, we have seen a mixed figure, really, or a mixed development. When we look at France and Germany, on average, cattle prices in both of those countries have increased. And in the case of Germany, currently at the moment, the R3 young bull price shows a 14% increase on where it was this time last year. So, that is positive. If we look at our own price currently, and if we take, for example, the 4.04 a kilo that was paid last week, that price is 17% ahead of where it was this week last year. But you have to take into account also that that was really the peak of the pandemic in terms of the impact that the cattle price, was suffering just in the early part of the COVID restrictions. So cattle prices at that time had fallen to a low level. But if we look at the situation currently on international markets, and some of these are the global leaders in terms of the volumes of beef that they produce and export. In the US, cattle prices are similar to EU levels, but they've increased by 6% in comparison to last year. Australia is a really standout one because cattle prices there have increased by 28% compared to this time last year. And even more dramatically in Brazil, we've seen a 39% increase in cattle prices, looking at where they are currently to this time last year. So all of those factors are very significant, and some of it is down to very strong Asian demand, particularly from China, in the case of South America, targeting that region for much more of their exports. In Australia, a lot of it is down to scarcity of their own production as a result of droughts in recent years. If we look at the market situation now briefly, I have here the retail, a breakdown of retail sales. These are from an agency called Kantar World Panel, who track the volumes and values of meat and other products that are being sold at retail level. So most recently, up until the end of March, for the 4-week period, we actually saw a slight decline, or quite a decline in beef purchases, similar to other meats. And mince sales in particular have declined in comparison to that same period last year. But I would have to bring to your attention that there was a very strong uplift this time last year when we saw increases of 23% in beef sales. So actually, if we compared ourselves to maybe a more normal situation as to what we had in that period in 2019, would be still very positive in comparison to the same periods. And if we look at the 12 weeks, for example, up to the end of March, overall we're still seeing very positive uplifts in both the Irish and UK markets with regard to purchases of beef, particularly steak, because in the midst of the pandemic, this is seen as certainly a comfort product and a luxury product, and one which I know certainly many of us would be happy to eat a little bit more of. And I have a summary now with regard to the different pieces of information there that we've shared. Irish cattle supplies are expected to decline by up to 120,000 head this year. We're looking at a tighter supply situation across UK and EU markets, a strong increase in the UK cattle price, as we saw there, and international markets similarly, like Australia and South America, where cattle prices have gotten up to very high levels in comparison to previous years. Here in Ireland, we've seen a strong recovery and improvement in recent weeks. As I said, it increased by 7 cents a kilo on average across the different grades last week, and a similar 7 cents a kilo the previous week. So, cattle prices certainly are getting up there. We're hearing of base prices of $4.10 a kilo for steers, increasingly being paid, and up to $4.20 a kilo for heifers as well. So, thankfully, those are back up to levels that are certainly a lot more encouraging for beef producers. Retail demand does remain strong, and certainly in comparison to more normal levels pre-COVID. And there is some optimism certainly of food service sector recovering, and as people are free and able to return to normal service at restaurants and so on, I'm sure a lot of them are looking forward to doing so. Particularly in the UK, which would be slightly ahead of us in terms of that recovery. And in relation to the economic environment, then the pace of economic recovery will influence the demand for meat. So we know that it's likely that consumer spending power may be slightly depressed as a result of all of the restrictions and some of the impact that is to follow. So we'll have to monitor that situation closely. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you on to my colleague Mark Zieg shortly, and Mark is going to give us an update in relation to promotional activities at Bord Bia.
Yeah, okay, so the three strategic priorities that we have for beef are to increase the Irish beef sales into our priority markets, so those are the better paying markets, and then the better paying customers within those markets. Then to get more Irish beef into their premium ranges and move up from standard to premium wherever we can, and to prioritize those opportunities where we put in our promotional efforts as well. And then to drive consumer awareness and purchase. So it's bringing people into those stores through the promotional activity and enticing them to trial and purchase Irish beef, and in the first instance to be aware of it. So moving on then to the next slide, we start off with insight work, and this is a tracker that we're looking into beef shoppers' insights on a 2-monthly basis through 7 markets that you can see here: the Irish, Dutch, Italian, British, German, Swedish and Belgian markets that are very important to us from a beef perspective. And as you can see, these are the intentions, what people say that they are going to do, and that they, you see here, they intend to increase their net consumption. So if you look at the very right-hand side, you can see there that in the January-February period, we had quite good growth. Now that is, you have to see in the perspective, A, that this is what people say they're going to do, and B, that this was ahead of the COVID period last year, where people went and increased their beef shopping behavior, as Joe pointed out earlier. So, but strong growth in intentions at that time already before that kicked in. So there is a good strong market and a good strong sentiment, I suppose, by consumers in terms of their beef purchase. Then moving on, the associations that they have with beef, and this is really something that we can take heart from and work on in terms of really pointing out the positives of beef and working with our customers to highlight these things and bring more people into the beef category and eating more beef. So you can see there across the markets, in terms of people agreeing with the statement that beef is the best source of animal protein you can buy, generally they're between 50 and even over 60% across the market. Then people saying, I think beef is the least processed of all meats. Again, you're seeing in the high 40s to mid 50s. And beef is a protein that is worth paying more for, probably the highest agreement there of that set of questions, and good increases as well over the previous year. So really a positive indication there from consumers with relation to beef and their beef consumption intentions. Something I'd also like to point out here at the bottom is the Bord Bia Lifestyle Trends report from early in this year. And just amid some of the noise, I suppose, about meat alternatives and people turning away from meat, this study found that in Ireland and Britain, the actual people adhering to a vegan lifestyle was 2%. So while a lot of people would associate themselves with that lifestyle, the actual people that said, well, I actually live a vegan lifestyle and eat vegan is 2%. The same for vegetarian. It's 8 and 9% in Ireland and Britain, respectively, that adhere to such a vegetarian lifestyle. Now, there's another category that I'd like to point out, the Deflecitarians, and they're higher, and I suppose we're seeing more growth there. And they're people, flexitarians, in case anyone isn't familiar with them, that are, I suppose, striving to reduce their meat, but they are eating meat on occasions. And they're, I suppose, an interesting group because they're people that can be tempted back to the meat and indeed the beef category. You know, if we can point out certain things around health or taste that are of a particular concern to them. In that context, just wanted to point out that the top 10 factors that people are naming across some of our priority markets here, Holland, Germany, and Italy, and what is influencing their choice of beef. So I've color-coded these. The green ones are the ones that we feel we're winning on, and their strengths for Irish beef. Whereas the orange ones, I suppose, are an amber light, where there can in these markets be room that we have to prove that we're good, and indeed some of the domestic lobbies or suppliers or whatever could be looking for more improvement in general on meat. This is not a reflection of Irish meat. So really some of the positives there that we can take, as pointed out before: taste, our outdoor reared system here, we're trusted, natural nutrition is important, the fact that beef is not factory farmed is important, traceability, sustainability. So there's a lot of strengths there that we have in Irish beef, which is something that we can work on across our promotions and driving those messages to consumers as they seek a product that they can be confident in and that will give them enjoyment, because at the end of the day, taste is the most important thing. Beef is an expensive product relative to other proteins and foods, so they want a rewarding experience, and that certainly is one of the strengths of Irish beef. Here's just some of those trust marks, as they're known, that are across the different markets, and not going into too much detail, but just showing most of them around welfare, some of them around eco, some of them around local schemes, and then indeed the PGI, which is seen as a strong endorsement in Europe when it's seen, especially in continental and southern continental European countries, as a mark of quality, and also, of course, of Europeanness, which is important in the context of the PGI applications that we currently have in Europe. Something here, I suppose, one of the reasons why we're working so hard, I suppose, on promoting Irish beef is that we have good awareness in some markets, and we have growing awareness, as you can see, the top bar in each of these being the 2020, the latest results. So prompted awareness, when we talk to consumers in these countries about Irish beef, their prompted awareness is high and growing. Where we have some room to improve, especially in markets that are perhaps newer for us, like Germany and Italy, you can see that the spontaneous awareness there is a little lower, 17 and 19%, even compared to somewhere like Holland, where Irish beef has had a prominent retail presence for a longer period of time. So that's really, as we can build up that spontaneous awareness and the associations with Irish beef, we can drive people to purchase. And in a lot of these markets as well, that's why they're priority markets, to pay a little more for Irish beef than the other products that are on the shelf. Not forgetting the UK, which is a slightly different picture. Again, we've been a part of the retail shelf for a long time. We have a positive propensity to purchase in the UK that is very high, around 75%. And also asking consumers here in this question, when shopping for beef, what you consider to be local, you can see that Ireland is very much there in the set of the other British Isles locations. And that's something that's very important to us, because it creates a strong basis for the retail customers and food service customers and the consumers to keep Irish beef on the shelf in the context of Brexit and the growing call for Britishness on the island of Britain. So just showing some of those promotions very quickly then. This is really about raising awareness with the broader public, making them aware of Irish beef and what it stands for quality, for natural production, for taste, for quality, yeah, just increasing those awareness figures. Then it's about driving them into the stores, into those accounts that have Irish beef. Here's an example of a priority customer in Germany that we're driving that higher value. They're very much at a premium level, and they're operating through a retail catalogue and also retail stores. They're actually the largest retailer in Germany, and we were live through the St. Patrick's Day period, I suppose, the 4 weeks around that, in 1,000 of their stores. We followed up the magazine promotion, which had a couple of dedicated pages to Irish beef and lamb, and then competitions. Also with in-store TV, stressing that we're 99% family farms, 90% grass in the diet, over 220 days at grass, and then backing that also up with heavy online promotions, because of course the in-store activity that one might do with tastings, etc., is something we can't just currently do. Then it's around building the preference, as we are here in Italy. You saw that outdoor campaign that was on the posters, also on the buses, bringing it in closer to the store, and then backing up that campaign on the Irish beef with point of sale stickers there on the pack, on the shelf, and posters that would be around it to drive purchase. And that was also a very successful promotion that we ran earlier in this year and plan to run again in the autumn period. In Britain, it's really about underlining our position there, and keeping the flag flying and keeping the positive acceptance and story going of British and Irish. And British and Irish is something that you would see on restaurant menus or even advertising by the retailers. That's priority number one. Sustainability is a real hot topic amongst the trade. And of course, Origin Green is really strong there. The grass-fed is something that is resonating there with customers, and they're having a serious look at in terms of differentiating Irish beef and getting us a cut above the rest. Then the consumer appeal, and as I pointed out earlier, taste really important there. And we reiterated that for the first time, actually, going on TV last year, and got a really strong response of over 50% of people there saying, as a result of seeing that ad, they would be more likely to purchase. So really strong, and something that we would intend to look at again. International markets, really strong growth there, as Joe pointed out earlier. So this is something that we're backing up, especially in Asian markets, through our EU campaigns with chefs masterclasses aimed at the trade, and countries like the Philippines and Vietnam. Also what we call East meets West chefs competitions in Korea and Vietnam. We're at the FoodX fair, one of the few trade fairs that actually happened this year, back in March. Some trade advertising which has popped up here, and then also backing that up with a virtual trade mission to China to reiterate our good position there, and in terms of ticking all the boxes that we should be let back into that market, and making that at a ministerial and government level. Just finally, before you hear from Mick on the grass-fed, just wanted to give some slides here on the market background to that. So before we developed that program a few years ago, we did extensive research around grass-fed across 11 countries and 13 customers. So half of consumers globally said that grass-fed would influence their choice. on meat, and 64% saying that they would actually pay more for it. Important as to why, and I pointed out a lot of issues and attitudes that people have to meat, and grass-fed is a really good fillip, I suppose, to communicate all that's positive about beef and allay some of the concerns that the consumers have there. So 98% saying grass-fed would be more natural, 80% saying better animal welfare, also relates to taste and things like nutrition and less pollutants or chemicals, etc., in the beef. So it's really ticking a lot of those really important boxes around questions that consumers are asking around beef currently. And finally then as well, it really has a strong appetite. So when we showed the grass-fed logo back in our core markets there, we asked them, you know, if you saw this logo on a pack, would it make you more likely or less likely, or makes no difference to buy? And really strongly over 50% and nearly up to 60% in markets like Germany and France, saying that net it would make them more likely to buy. So we're very excited about that, and are developing listings with a number of different customers there in Europe and beyond. So it certainly has a good lot of potential there. So very briefly then, a summary is consumption of beef remains positive in our key markets. 90% of consumers are still consuming beef despite all the noise around meat alternatives, etc. So we have everything to work on there. Our priority is convert positive associations with Irish beef into purchase. We have a lot of multi-layered campaigns across outdoor, in-store, online, etc., scheduled for the second half of the year. Also maximizing the international market opportunities and diversifying that business opportunity that we have there, and rolling out verified grass-fed, key to premiumizing Irish beef with those, I suppose, very exacting consumers, but also giving that premium opportunity. So that's it from me. I'll hand back to Mick now for his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. Thanks very much for that comprehensive overview. And we're going to hear from Mick, as you said, in a moment. But first of all, we're going to very briefly conduct a poll with our audience in order to get your take on, I suppose, the market situation and what the outlook may be. You've heard a number of positive factors and maybe a few others maybe that, you know, just would you know, get us thinking in terms of what the international situation may be and so on. Hopefully that there's opportunities there over the coming while. So just asking all of our audience, which of the following factors will have the most important impact on the Irish beef sector for the rest of 2021? And hopefully this will be coming up on your screens now. There's a number of different options, and if you just select one and input that. So you've a choice between lower domestic beef supplies in the UK and EU markets, rising beef prices across key international exporters, reopening of the European food service market, and improving access for Irish beef to international markets. We heard from Mark there that hopefully there are opportunities there, particularly in relation to regaining access to the Chinese market in particular, that may be one that we hope will bear fruit and come on stream anyway in the near future. So I think we've had a good number of people already interact with that, Mick, and answer that question. That's great. We have actually a result coming up. So 42% of you believe that the contraction in availability and certainly supply and demand are key contributing factors, and obviously nobody different than farmers to recognise that fact. So lower availability you see as being the key one, and next after that the reopening of the food service market, that looks set to drive demand. 30% of you felt that, and then 24% of you felt that regaining access or improving access to international markets would be a significant factor, and just 4% then, you know, reflecting that key international exporters, whether it be the likes of Australia and Brazil, you know, that may increase international prices, but it may not necessarily lead to higher prices here at home, here in Ireland, and we can discuss that in a few minutes. So thanks very much for your interaction with that, and I'm going to pass you over to Mick Houlihan. Mick is as we heard, our sustainability and quality assurance manager, and he's going to give us an update with regard to the grass-fed standard. Thanks very much, Mick.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks very much. So, yeah, good evening, everyone. If you just bear with me here now, and I'll get things running here. So you might let me know if you can see that there, Joe.
Yeah, that's coming up there now, Mick. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Joe. So, okay, good evening, everyone. And yeah, as Joe said, Mick Houlihan is my name. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to take you through the grass-fed standard and some information, I suppose, around that. But maybe just before I do, just to very quickly give an update in terms of the Sustainable Beef and Lamb Assurance Scheme. In terms of membership, at the moment, membership stands at over 53,600 farms. As everyone will be aware, the remote audit process is ongoing. We're almost a year conducting remote audits now, so we've been under lockdown on and off for over a year. The remote audit process didn't actually kick off until May of last year, so we're coming up on a year now. But in that time, I suppose there's a phenomenal amount of audits been done, with over 39,000 remote audits conducted as well. And again, I suppose that really kind of points to the flexibility and adaptability, I suppose, of scheme members in terms of taking on a new approach and getting the audits done as well. We've been trying to ensure that there's additional supports available to farmers for the remote audit process, and just, I suppose, by way of indicating the way things have scaled up with our help desk. Pre-COVID-19 and pre-remote auditing, the staff and the help desk were dealing with about 2,000 calls a month, whereas now that's over 8,000 calls a month, but making calls to farmers to offer support, and then obviously receiving calls from farmers and trying to guide and advise in relation to remote audits. The phone number for the help desk is there at the bottom of the slide, so anyone that wants a bit of support at the moment, either with an audit that's maybe coming up or to work through the closeout process, by all means make sure and get in contact with the staff there on the help desk to be more than happy and capable of helping. So I'll move on now to talk about the grass-fed standard, I suppose the first thing to say about the standard is that, similar to all the other schemes, quality assurance and sustainability schemes that we operate, it's an accredited scheme. We achieved this with the Irish National Accreditation Board in the middle of last year. So as a standard in itself, it is accredited to ISO 17065 for standard for product certification. So that's a hugely significant and hugely important thing in relation to the standard. And it's something that adds a real robustness to the standard, particularly when what we have here in Ireland now is going to be compared against other grass-fed standards that exist out there. To move on and talk about why do we develop a standard, and really, I suppose Mark has kind of touched on a lot of this already. You know, we're all quite well aware of the strong grass-fed credentials we have in terms of beef production here in Ireland. But I suppose the key thing that we have here as well, that an awful lot of other countries and other standards don't have access to, is information. Information in relation to feed consumed on farms, grazing seasons on farms, and this is all information that's generated through the S-class audits. So again, farmers will be familiar with the audit process, where the auditors are asking those questions about when animals are turned out in the spring, when they're housed in the winter, and the level of concentrates fed and so on. That's all. That's really crucial information in terms of the grass-fed standard, because that's what enables us to calculate the grass-fed figures for individual farms. So it was a real opportunity to develop a standard using a robust scientific approach. So building on or leveraging the Teagasc carbon footprint model, which has an element to it that looks at the diet calculation. So looking at that feed information and grazing season information to be able to generate a grass-fed figure for every farm that participates. So in terms of the grass-fed standard, as I said, you know, the S-Class audit is critical to it, because that's where the information is generated to be able to calculate the grass-fed figures for each farm. But this is a processor standard. So when it comes to conducting audits against this standard, Bord Bia will be doing these audits with the meat processors or on the meat processors. And really what we will be looking there is for any plant that applies to become a member of the scheme, that they're interacting with the Bord Bia database to do the assessments in relation to animals presented for slaughter, that they're doing them correctly, and that you know, upon getting the result of the status of the individual animals, that the proper traceability, segregation, and labeling procedures are in place in the plant, and that they're being followed, so that we can ensure that, you know, anything that leaves the plant with a grass-fed label or a grass-fed logo on it is most certainly after coming from animals that are grass-fed. There's a number of criteria or a number of requirements that the standard lists in relation to eligibility for animals. So when it comes to that assessment piece, and just the next couple of slides will just run through them. So the first is that, you know, animals that are being assessed must be coming from herds that are members of the beef and lamb assurance scheme. The second rule is that the assessment of those animals must be done using the grass-fed model so that's that Teagasc Bord Bia grass-fed model that sits on the Bord Bia database. So that's the only assessment tool or the only assessment calculator that the grass-fed standard permits the use of when it comes to that animal assessment. The next rule again, you know, follows through in that it's only information that comes from the S-Class audits and that's stored on the Bord Bia quality assurance database can be used to calculate the status of those animals. So not that there is any real other sources of this type of information available, but if there was, processors or anybody else looking to become members of the grass-fed scheme would not be able to use that information and to calculate an animal status. It can only be with the S-Class information. To move on then, the next element that must be conformed to is that the information that is used in terms of the calculation of the grass-fed status of the animal, it must be available for the animal's whole life. Now there is an allowance on this, and on the next slide we'll come to that, and we'll go into a little bit more detail in terms of some allowances that are allowed within the calculations of the grass-fed status. The next rule then, this really kind of points to the thresholds of the volume of grass or the volume of the diet that needs to be grass in order for the animal to be considered grass-fed. So it has to be a minimum of 90% of the animal's diet over its lifetime needs to be grass or grass forage. And then the final rule in this case relates to access to grazing or access to outdoors or pasture access, as it's defined in the standard. And again, the definition in the standard requires that animals have access to grass or grazed outdoors for 220 days a year. There is a tolerance of 40 days less allowed in there, and again that's to account for maybe regional differences or differences in terms of land types and soil types, or differences in terms of weather conditions from one year to the next that might maybe limit grazing at certain parts of the year. So if we go on to talk a little bit about how the assessment actually works then once an animal is presented at slaughter. So the animal moves from the farm to the factory. Once it gets to the factory, the ear tag of the animal is scanned. The movement history for that animal coming from the AIMS database along with the tag number is then sent to the Bord Bia quality assurance database. And then the database is performing the eligibility checks for the animal. So what it's doing is it's looking at the farms where that animal has resided on over its life. It's looking to see, is there S-Plus information available for those farms, and if there is information available, what is it saying about the grass-fed figures for those farms? And it then extracts the grass-fed figures for the farms that the animals have resided on throughout its life, and it calculates the grass-fed figure for that individual animal based on the time, the amount of time is spent on each farm, and the relevant grass-fed figures for each of those farms. So again, this really kind of highlights the significance of the information that's coming through in those S-Plus audits, because that's what allows us to calculate the figures for each individual farm, and then subsequently calculate the figures for each individual animal once it's presented in the factory. So once that check has been done on the Bord Bia database, the result is returned to the processor, and it's fairly straightforward. The animal qualifies or it doesn't. Where it does qualify, then the factory must ensure that they're implementing their policies and procedures with regard to traceability and segregation and labelling, as I mentioned earlier on, and all of that obviously will be subject to checks when we come and do our audits on the meat plants. Where meat plants become members of the grass-fed scheme and through audit they become certified, they are then eligible to apply for use of the grass-fed logo on grass-fed verified products. And again, we have a system in place that there's a application process there that processors must go through, again, to ensure that all the checks and balances are correct when it comes to the application of the logo, and the follow through on that then happens when we come and do the inspections on the meat plants then after that as well. I mentioned on one of the previous slides that there are some allowances that we make when we're doing the calculations in relation to the grass-fed status of each animal. The first is that there's a grace period for the first 9 months of the animal's life. So again, look, as a calf on beef farms with suckler farms, you know, they're spending that time typically in the fields with their mothers anyway. It's almost a given that the animals are on grass there as well. So we don't factor in the status of the farms where the animal spends the first 9 months of its life. After that, however, then it's important that we have information from the S-Plus audits for each farm where the animal resides for the remainder of its life. And again, that information relates to the feed that's used on the farm and the levels, the feeding rates on the farm, and again the housing and turnouts of the grazing season for that farm as well. We have made an allowance where an animal resides in a herd for only 7 days or less at some stage throughout its life. So where that happens, you know, we consider that this is an animal in transit. You know, so maybe an animal that's maybe moving through a dealer herd or something like that. And you know, rather than knocking that animal out in terms of being eligible to qualify as grass-fed, what we simply do is say, look, it was an animal in transit for a few days, so we don't include that herd when we're doing the grass diet calculations, or we're doing the checks in terms of the S-Plus certification. Similarly then as well, if during the calculation we come across a farm where an animal resided for less than 30 days, and if for some reason that farm fails to meet the grass-fed thresholds in terms of the grazing days, for example, we exclude that farm from the overall calculation then as well. And again, this is a measure that we implement because we felt that it overly penalises an individual animal where it spends a very short time of its life on a farm that's not grass-fed. And then the final condition to animal assessment is a fairly straightforward one. Animals presented from feedlots are excluded, so they cannot qualify as grass-fed. And again, you know, the fact that the outdoor grazing is such an important element of the grass-fed standard, this would be fairly obvious why the animals coming from feedlots would be excluded. So just to talk about why animals might not qualify for a moment. So when we do our analysis and do our assessment on this from time to time, and we try and understand, well, why are animals not qualifying? The number one reason by far is that there is no S-class information for the animal's entire life. So at some stage in the animal's life, it resided on a farm where it's not a member of the S-class scheme. There's no information available. We can't do a calculation or a complete calculation as to what the grass-fed status of that animal is. So unfortunately, then it means that the animal is knocked out and is not eligible to go forward as grass-fed. The second most common reason that we see for animals not qualifying relates to the pasture access. So, you know, this is typically then, you know, animals maybe that are coming from feedlots, or it may be that, you know, they've just missed out on the minimum pasture access requirement, even taking into account the 40-day allowance that we have there as well. The next reason is fairly straightforward. Again, it looks at it relates to the residency requirements. So animals been presented from herds where they haven't met the full 70 days requirement. And then the last reason we don't see very often, but again, in some cases where the calculations show that actually these animals more than 10% or less than 90%, I should say, of their diet over their lifetime has been grass, and that's what knocks them out. Just an important thing to say here is that an animal may fail on the grass-fed checks for more than one reason. So if anybody is doing the sums quickly across the bottom there, they'll see that those figures add up to 36, but that's not a true reflection of the number of animals that qualify. An animal may fail, or a true reflection of why the animals may fail. The animal may fail because there's a gap in the S-class history, but it also may fail because, you know, there's not enough grass in the diet, or for any combination of the reasons that you see there. So when we look at the figures in terms of qualifying animals, and just having run an analysis in terms of the number of animals that have been queried on the system since the 1st of January this year, we see that over 265,000 animals have been queried, and 73% of those animals have qualified as grass-fed, so meeting all the criteria that we've talked about throughout the presentation there, and their animals then that are eligible to go into grass-fed batches and eligible to be processed into products that could be applied for that the law can be applied to be used on then as well. And when we dig a little deeper into the results on this, we see that the average diet of the animals that qualify is 97% grass. So I suppose there can be no doubt over the fact that these are grass-fed animals when you see a figure like 97%. And this it's consistently up around there anytime we do this analysis, in around 97%. So again, I suppose just to summarize, you know, we have a really good story to tell in relation to grass and our grass-based systems here, and we've always told it, I suppose, but the grass-fed standard now allows us to really kind of prove and verify in a scientific way, and using real information, real data generated on farms to prove that beef from Ireland is truly grass-fed. So that's it from me. I hope you found that of some interest, and thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Mick, for that overview. That was really concise, good overview anyway of how the grass-fed standard operates, and all of the different combinations with regard to the requirements at farm level and so on. Now we have a good few questions in already, but we're going to take a few minutes just to go through the questions. I appreciate now that we're up to the time, and we said we'd keep you for about an hour, but we have a number of questions. We'll try and get through them now fairly rapidly, and between myself and my colleagues, we're just going to shoot through them fairly quickly. So there was a first question which I'll take, is around Irish cattle prices are rising, which is positive, but with the tightness in supply in Britain and very high cattle prices there, should we be getting closer to those levels? You know, we saw where cattle prices here in Ireland last week averaged 404, but we saw prices of 466 on average in the UK. And we know that in 2020, Irish beef exports to the UK accounted for 46% of the total. So the remainder on average was sent into other markets where cattle prices are considerably lower. And you know, we don't necessarily have access to all of the customers in the UK market either. There are some customers who have an all British sourcing policy with regard to beef. And with regard to the year to date, then we know that during the first 2 months of the year, there was some Brexit related disruption. Some customers had bought forward and bought ahead and put product into storage and so on. And there was a little bit of uncertainty around what the trading environment would be at the end of last year. So as a result of that, actually our exports to the UK declined by 17% during January and February this year. So that would have contributed certainly to some of the difficulty that we saw earlier on in the year, where we know that Irish cattle prices were at a low level. And even though the Irish cattle price has risen, you know, as this question I suppose is getting at, the UK prices have even risen to a higher level, and that reflects, I suppose, the very strong retail demand and the preference by some of those customers to only buy British beef. I hope that addresses the question anyway to some extent. I have a question here with regard to consumers' likelihood of returning to normal service restaurants once the restrictions are lifted. So just to very briefly give you an update, we have a number of surveys and studies by Bord Bia and a few others, particularly in the UK market, which indicate that a very, very high proportion of consumers are really looking forward to you know, getting back to normal restaurant dining. Certainly somewhere in the order of 75 to 80% of those who responded to any of the surveys that we've conducted are optimistic and certainly looking forward to the lifting of those restrictions. So there's no doubt that the figures would be similar across other markets. I have also an observation and a question, I suppose, with regard to cattle supplies, whereby we saw those forecasts and cattle are certainly going to be somewhat tighter between now and the year end than in previous years. But what about the younger cattle numbers coming through? We saw in the 12 to 24 month age bracket an increase of 61,000 in the males and over 22,000 in the beef bred heifers. So that certainly does indicate that in 2022 we'll see a recovery in production. We'll see cattle numbers maybe not getting back up to last year's levels, but certainly being somewhat closer to them. You know, that this year we'll see that reduction, but they will catch up to some extent in 2022. But elsewhere around Europe, we're not seeing anywhere near the same, I suppose, recovery forecast. So hopefully import demand and prices can remain strong. A number of questions here that focus on the grass-fed standard. So very briefly, I'm gonna maybe them across to my colleagues. First of all, Mark Zieg, I'm going to put a question to you regarding the grass-fed standard. And I know it was obviously in development for a little while, and we put quite a lot of work into it long before the rollout of the standard. But in which markets have we experienced the strongest demand so far? And Are there new listings, or is it mainly customers asking to upgrade to verified Irish grass-fed beef?
Yeah, Joe, it's really across all our markets. I suppose that's the beauty of the grass-fed advantage we have here, is that it has global appeal. So, you know, from the UK, we see that it's something that our customers there are really interested on, and you know, I think we'll have some developments there quite soon as well on the continent. You know, from Scandinavia down to Mediterranean countries there. Italy, Spain, there's good demand there, and of course, you know, in countries like Belgium and Germany and Holland, grass has been central to our image there. So there's huge interest. There's a lot of discussions, and you know, it's really about finding those customers where we can drive the premium out of this advantage we have. Also in the newer markets in Japan, especially, we're seeing strong demand from there. It's something that's very different to their own production, and they don't have a lot of grass. They have to actually import a lot of fodder for their own Wagyu type cattle. So this is something that's really different to what they have. It's something that we've been observing as we've been in that market, and we're actually doing some taste tests with consumers in Japan in over the summer months, and really looking at the opposition that we're going up against, and we're quite confident we'll do well there, and that'll drive advantage for us in that market too.
Okay, very good, Mark. And very briefly, we know that Bord Bia has submitted an application to the EU Commission for PGI status for Irish grass-fed beef. Can you give us a very brief update regarding that application?
Yeah, just the brief version of that, as you asked for, Joe, is it went into Europe in November following our own consultation period here in previous to that. There's a similar process, I suppose. They're doing the legal checks, and that the application stacks up and is suitable. We're due to get some feedback on that, and to see whether we can get to the next stage very soon. And then you'll have a similar consultation period in Europe, where other member states can make certain observations or ask questions about it, and then it would be after that period that we should learn in normal circumstances whether we've been successful.
Okay, thanks for that. Hopefully that's positive. Over to you, Mick. Within the grass-fed standard, is there any restriction on the age or grade of animal or numbers of farms that they've decided on?
Very short answer to that, Joe, is no. We don't have any restrictions in that way. The standard is open to all, and yeah, there's no fighting in labour any further. The simple answer is no, Joe, no restrictions. Very good,
very good. And I know it's a kind of a bit of misinformation at times, that people feel that Bord Bia requires of farmers certain grades or residency periods or numbers of movements. It's something that's more related to the in-spec bonus, which at times gets called a Bord Bia bonus or a quality assurance bonus. It's a kind of a misnomer, really, or a mislabel. And I have a question here, Mick, which is interesting. Can Bord Bia give an individual producer information around the proportion of grass that we've found, for example, within the audit or within the farm survey? And similarly, would we be able to give an overview or any advice in relation to kind of maximising the likelihood of their animals meeting the requirements?
Yeah, okay, so the way the system operates is that there's a grass-fed figure calculated for each individual farm. So anyone that's interested to know what that grass-fed figure is, we can certainly provide that. The thing to be mindful of, though, is that that's the figure for your farm. When it comes to the animals, and that kind of relates to the second part of your question, then the assessment is done on each individual animal. So if your animals are born on your farm and you're rearing them all the way through to slaughter, then the figure you get for your farm is the figure that applies to the animals. But if you're operating a system where maybe you're buying stores and bringing them through to beef, then the grass-fed figures for those animals will differ depending on their history, their residency history, and the farms that they've resided on. So the individual farm figure comes into play there. And for farmers that are buying stores or in that sort of system, a key thing for them to watch out for is that the animals are coming from S-class certified herds, because that will mean that we'll be able to generate a grass-fed figure for those animals. The other thing that would be a watch out as well is just the number of residencies that an animal has, because again, when we do some of the analysis in terms of the queries that have been done, the more movements that an animal has, or the more residencies that an animal has had over its life, the greater the likelihood that the animal won't qualify as grass-fed, because there's going to be gaps along the way somewhere where there's no S-class information.
Okay, thanks very much, Mick. Now, a few queries about that, but I think that covers it with regard to, you know, the likelihood, as you say, and that the percentage applies to the individual farm, but also the calculation then is applied on the individual animal at the point of slaughter. So it's really around knowing the history of that animal. If they come from quality assured, for example, farms, either since birth or since they were less than 9 months old, then they're very, very likely to qualify.
Yeah.
And I have one last question, Mick, which is regarding the grass-fed standard. Who is eligible to apply the logo to the packs of qualifying Irish beef? And again, I know you touched on this, but is this verified by Bord Bia within, for example, our quality assurance audits within the meat plants? Yeah,
so each plant that wants to apply for membership of the grass-fed scheme will do that themselves. We're taking applications. We have a number of audits that have been done on the meat processors, and the way that it's typically working is that those grass-fed audits have been done in conjunction with the meat processor audits that we conduct. So we conduct the meat processor audits at 18-month intervals, with a guaranteed unannounced spot audit at some stage within that 18 months as well. And we're going to follow the same sort of pattern when it comes to the grass-fed audits, by doing the grass-fed audits alongside the MP Quest audits. You know, when it comes to the traceability and segregation element of the MP Quest audits, it's the exact same almost as what we're looking at in terms of the grass-fed piece as well. So it makes a lot of sense, and there's a lot of efficiencies in terms of doing them side by side. Once a plant becomes certified, then there's a separate process for them to go through an application process for use of the logo on product, and that follows the well-established application process that we have for use of the quality assurance or the Q mark logo as well. So a fairly robust system, Joe, that we have there for the whole lot.
Okay, thanks, Mick. I appreciate that. Mark, a quick question for you, and I appreciate now people have stayed on, so we're gonna just do a couple of very, very brief last couple of questions that we have here. I have a question with regard to imports of beef into Europe. Do we expect imports of beef to contract given those higher South American prices and I suppose the uncertainty around food service?
Yeah, well, to date in Europe, that uncertainty has dictated that the South American imports are down very strongly. Ever since the beginning of COVID, it was about 10% of a reduction. There isn't a lot of it about, because it does tend to be a product that is mainly in food service, and the unpredictability of that and the long shipping distance dictates that it's not really suitable for the market in those times. We have to watch out what's going to happen, in what way it opens up. Of course, the importers into Europe will be watching that very closely, and seeing whether it's worthwhile, or whether the orders are going to come. And there could be a scenario where the European price is generally the best on steaks, which is the product that they're exporting here. And if they see it as a viable option, certainly that they could put more product in here in the autumn time.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Well, hopefully the fact that their prices are higher will mean that they won't be as competitive, and that will keep a floor under European prices. Hopefully, one very final question, and similarly, it's with regard to imports of beef, but this time at Irish levels. So, just asking, how much beef do we import into Ireland, and what's the kind of overall mix? So as we know, we're within the EU, and we're very reliant on exporting our beef, but a certain amount of beef does come into Ireland, most of that for processing or further processing and re-export. So we know that in total last year, the imports would have been totaled at just over 30,000 tonnes. But bear in mind that we actually export the majority of our own production, over 500,000 tonnes. We produce in total over 600,000 tonnes. So, that volume of imports is very, very small, relative to what we're producing and what we're exporting. And bear in mind also that in Ireland every year we consume in total an amount of about 90,000 tonnes. So that gives you a kind of an indication of the imports relative to the overall supply balance and the importance of the beef industry here at home. So hopefully that gives you an overall picture anyway of not just of the supply balance, but of the overall market situation currently, of Bord Bia's promotional activities, including with regard to our quality assurance scheme and the development of the grass-fed standard, which we're really enthusiastic and ambitious for, that will really make a difference in terms of driving the value of Irish beef exports over the years ahead. So finally, I'd like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for taking the time to tune in this evening and join our webinar. Hopefully we'll follow on again over the coming months and do another one in order to update you on developments which take place in the meantime. Thanks also to my colleagues for participating and speaking, and for setting up the webinar. I encourage you and remind you to visit Bord Bia's website, where we have a lot of this information, and similarly we'll be uploading the presentations to our website also. So I'd like to wish you a nice evening and a healthy and safe outlook anyway in terms of your farming and for the time ahead for yourselves and your family. So thanks very much for joining us, and best